Welcome back to Use It or Lose It, the podcast where conservation meets truth and truth isn't always polite. Today we're sitting with a man who has probably shaped more wildlife policy, court cases, and sustainable use victories than most governments combined. John J. Jackson III, attorney, co founder of Conservation Force, activist, historian, hunter, and one of the leading defenders of community based conservation worldwide. If you've ever heard of a species saved through sustainable use revenue, a community empowered through regulated hunting, or a successful fight against a bad listing at CITES, chances are Conservation Force was behind it. John has fought in the US courts, in the African courts, at CITES, at COPs, before the US Fish and Wildlife Service, against NGO misinformation campaigns, and for the rights of rural communities whose voices rarely reach the global stage. And today, with COP20, we're talking about what it takes to defend sustainable use in a world hypnotized by protectionist slogans. John, welcome to Use It or Lose It.
Thank you. I hope I can say something of value.
So, John, to begin the podcast, you spent decades fighting in the trenches where conservation meets law. Before we get into the COP20 and into CITES battles, tell us what pushed you to create Conservation Force in the first place?
That's a question I've been asking differently many times. And my answer is different each time because it depends on how the question is asked. I mean, I when I was a child, I could live near a zoo. And I could hear the elephants trumpeting at night, the lions roaring. And in those days, it was before air conditioning and closed windows. I lived in fear as a child of those animals getting freed. When I grew up and was successful in life as an attorney, I started spending my money in the outdoors in the far places where these animals live.
Right. I've read a lot of things that you have said in your lifetime. One of the things that struck me deeply was wildlife survives when people have rights to use it. Now, why does the world still struggle with this idea?
To some, it's counterintuitive if you use wildlife that you care about it. Those people are misinformed. They haven't thought it through. It doesn't. It's actually protection can be perverse. The people that care the most about wildlife is those that are free to use it. That has value to them, and what's called additive value that the use of it gives to the wildlife. Game animals, for example, have an advantage, not a disadvantage. In North America, we know that very well, that there are more ducks than there would be because we shoot them. Those are people that care enough to be out there, as Aldo Leopold said, a half an hour before daylight. They want to hear the goose music. These people care. There is no such thing as being a true sportsman without being a true conservationist. We have to have conservation. There'll be nothing to hunt and no place to hunt. You need habitat first. You need laws and regulations, control of poaching. You need all that. You need an army of people to pay for it because there's an army of people competing with it that are depleting it. It's taking its habitat away. It's farm fields replaced with timber fields. It's fundamentally true that you have to have conservation to continue to hunt. And every true sportsman, at least once he matures, understands that. And many of us become lifetime conservationists.
Let's talk about the courtroom for a second. Now, you've balanced out two lives almost, right? In terms of being in the courtroom, as well as being at events like CITES, at events like COP, fighting for the rights of not just wildlife, but also the people who live next to wildlife. Now, you've also fought some landmark cases, that have literally kept sustainable use alive. You know, elephant imports, lion listings, black rhino trophy permits, markhor, angoli,
Polar bear.
polar bears. What's the hardest part of explaining to courts and governments that hunting can save species?
If I understand your question, the hardest part is that the ignorant public that seems to outnumber those in the know, those who understand how it works. It's very easy to confuse the general public because of this false perception that how can you care for it if you use it? The truest stewards of wildlife, even captive game like domestic livestock, the shepherds, a sheep eat them. Okay, but who was the best protector of the sheep? The shepherds, and the hunting community, or the user community, or the shepherds of wildlife and its habitat. And there's nothing else that no one that's more protective of this resource in the long run and in the balance of things. It's fundamentally flawed, but it's who would expect the public to know any better? There's so much misinformation out there, but it's there's no question that the sporting way of life leads people to care, and to and time and energy and capacity leads people to save wildlife, and more wildlife than anybody else.
John, would you say that in many conservation cases, the courtroom isn't fighting poaching, it's fighting misinformation?
Yes, I had a federal judge in Washington, D.C. once said, aren't y'all hunters? Don't you kill these animals? How can you profess to have standing in my court to is that a pretense? And I said, no, Your Honor. I was caught by surprise. I said, people that are gardeners raise roses, and they care about them more than anybody. They cut them off at the neck when it's a time. And that's all we do in sport hunting. Waterfowl. The greatest most important thing in a waterfowl is a habitat. And guess who saves the most wetlands? Ducks Unlimited. And they have a shotgun on their cover. Right? And I met a few more examples. He said, oh, I understand. You're perfectly clear. And he told me then, Randy Roosevelt was one of our hunters from New York. This is a federal court in New York City. He said, and he saved more wildlife than everybody else combined? And yes, Your Honor, that's correct. We were in the Teddy Roosevelt Federal Courthouse on across from New York in the Bronx.
Yeah. Well, that is more often than not, right? I mean, what we see, what my experience is, what I understand, that in all these legal battles, do you ever have a moment where you think or you feel that if we lose this legal battle, we lose the species?
There's no question about it. So that's we can't afford to lose. But if we do, we're going to care about that loss more than anybody because we have the most to gain. Our very existence, once you become really get attached to the greater outdoors, and all game, not just game animals, but all wildlife depends on that habitat and all that the hunting community generates. It would be there's the alternatives to use in most cases is and I mean most habitat outside of very protected areas, the most protected areas, is dependent upon the revenue and the army of sportsmen. And you stack outside of the buffer areas, for example, the wildlife moves in and out. They need to have value outside of the protected area. So it's most of the habitat, it's most of the wildlife. It's essential. We really get compromised. And the most disappointing thing I see in my life is where we do lose, and the real losers are the loss of habitat, the local community, all the benefits to society that are spin-offs of the activity. When we lose, everybody loses. But guess who loses the most? The sportsmen, because they're the ones that care the most. And they prove it. We pay the bills. All right. We not in America understand this about sportsmen. They're the givers, not the takers. They pay most of the bills. They secure the habitat. They pay for the research. They pay for the anti-poaching. They pay everyone, and are paid by no one. They're the givers, not the takers. So there's a misconception about that. Who really cares the most?
Well, picking up on exactly what you said right now, John, I want to talk about the elephant in the conference hall, the NGO influence. Now, when I started my career as a filmmaker and I got into wildlife filmmaking, my intention was that, hey, I'm gonna film the tigers, I'm gonna film the elephants, typical David Attenborough BBC style, like with a voiceover coming and look at this beautiful tiger and blah 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 blah. It's only when I actually went on field and spent time with the people living next to wildlife that my perception started to change. So, and when I understood that there's a certain very strong sense of NGO influence that had made me think like that in the past. Now, picking up again on what you just said, that it's the sportsmen who save pretty much every single thing. Animal rights organizations have systematically injected anti-use ideology, into IUCN, into CITES, into national laws, public narratives, and even funding systems. From where you sit, John, how does this machine actually work?
Well, unfortunately, it's easy to fool the public, like that federal judge. It doesn't quite make sense to people who don't understand it. And that sportsmen don't really care. But not only they pay the biggest bills, share the bills, because they care, and they have the most to lose. And when you cross that misinformation gap, it's easy to understand that you have to have a sportsman, or you're going to lose most of what exists. On the other side, the animal activists, they have a gimmick, a very simple gimmick. They confuse people about the existence of wild animals with domesticated animals. That when a deer hunter is acquiring some game meat, hare hunters, they project that as someone's killing a dog or a cat. And, of course, they're against all use of wildlife in any form, or domestic. They don't want you to have ownership of pets. They're that protective. No matter what you do, you'll never satisfy them because they're not interested in the human relationship with wildlife. They're not really interested in its survival. Point blank, I have talked to leadership of animal rights groups, and their leadership has told me over and over again for years that we'd rather see wildlife cease to exist than be hunted. To them, it's a moral issue, their sense of morals and right and wrong, a new form of morality. And it's not to do with steel conservation. The hunter is concerned about growing the species, but securing its habitat. The animal rights group is concerned about stopping the use of wildlife. That no matter what the cost is, they would rather it cease to exist than be hunted. Think about that, what it means. This is their actual choice of words. I've seen them in federal court tell the federal judge, Your Honor, our clients don't want animals in zoos. The judge said, you mean some of your clients? No, Your Honor, all of our clients would rather they cease to exist. And the judge said, well, you don't understand these animals are going to be terminated. That was the word that the judge used. If they can't be imported into the United States for American zoos. Yes, Your Honor, we understand that perfectly. We'd rather that it be terminated than spend their lives in the zoo. The judge ruled against them. Right? But it was just one more form of the same statement that they don't care about the people. The rights of animals are taken away from people. But those very people then don't care about the wildlife. The wildlife becomes a liability, and its habitat becomes a liability. Other things are more important when people can't use the resource. Right? It can be made valuable, added to its value added, or it can be a negative. And animal rights groups really don't care about that. They're more concerned with the actions of the traditional conservation actions than and prohibiting it, preventing it in any way, Machiavellian way they can, than perpetuating the resource, animals as a resource, or even treating animals as a resource. The greatest wealth, the Inuits in Canada, or the indigenous people in Africa, is their resources. But the only thing the animal rights groups care about is limiting, prohibiting the use, the dominion over these things. But there's a very dominion that's necessary. The survival of these animals in their habitat, in their prey base, their environment doesn't exist by accident anymore. Everything requires management and wildlife management. There are schools on it, and universities on it, but animal rights groups want to let you know that. They really have undue influence because of the masses are so ignorant.
So, would it be fair to say that conservation is no longer about ecosystems, it's about optics?
The perception, you say, is a bad misperception, is governing is playing too much of a role. Misinformation is always like that. Perception sometimes is a rule, and you might say, well, it's perception rules and governs what happens, but we can't allow that as sportsmen. We got to save the resource. We cannot allow people to be ignorant. So what you're doing right now in questioning me is very important, essential that we correct emission pressures.
Can you tell me about potentially what was the most damaging myth that you had to fight in court?
We might be on it already that the usage is that it's not renewable. All right, that it exists without having this extra value. That it will survive the competition for space and for food without its the value added by its use. Management, smart management, wildlife management requires the systematic design of programs that enhance the survival of species. Conservation Force is a specialist in that. We have 20 biologists, all right, in the field at any one time, developing hunting-based systems to secure the habitat, to give that value to local people, to make them participants in the decision-making process is so very, very important. A sense of ownership through participation reward. These people bear the cost. This is what we're actually about, and it works almost virtually everywhere we work. The wildlife is growing, the habitat is increasing. It's hard to increase habitat today.
Yeah. That's another thing I hear a lot from the public, at least. I often hear the public complain that, let the people who live next to wildlife suffer because they have, taken over the space of wildlife. Why is it so easy to make such statements? And more often than not, they're the urban elites. They're the privileged crowd that's sitting on the $50,000 sofa and says these things about people who are literally living right next to predators. Where does this kind of thinking come from, John? That we have taken over their space, so we deserve to die.
Well, the reality is we'll take over more of their space unless there's somebody on their side. And the people on their side the most are the hunters that need to secure that habitat and protect the animals. This is what it comes down to. So it leads to it should lead to a false conclusion. It cuts both ways. All right. If you're in their habitat, you're going to be more in their habitat if they don't have value. That's why adding additions to the value are so important. Given through its use, generating revenue. Now, you got to understand this, that this is all systematically designed by experts long before the animal rights groups got that foothold. 100 years ago, people were designing systems that where it generate revenue for perpetuation and management, that the sportsmen, when they use it, it's a structured system. It's licensed, regulated hunting. It's not a free fall out there. Where it is, so be it. But in most cases, most of the hunting today is licensed and regulated and fostered by law because of its benefits. And they don't go away just because animal rights groups are misinforming people. The reality is most of the wildlife that exists today exists because of the American sportsmen. And I'm talking about American sportsmen because that 70%, 80% of the expenditures in Africa.
Yep. Well, to the audience, I just want to point out that we're having this podcast sitting at the COP20 in Uzbekistan. John, this year, sustainable use is under attack from perpetually every angle, from marine species to mammals to ambiguous precautionary listings. From your long history at CITES, John, what worries you the most?
That talking about the growth of people, there's more and more people that are misinformed. That scares me the most.
But keeping the context of the COP20 in mind and how the sustainable use is under attack from every angle, with the marine species, with the mammals, all the precautionary listings that are going on.
Precautionary is the word. The cautionary principle, some call it, is really just an approach that better safe than sorry has to be applied with judgment. You don't stop the use of a species altogether by listing it, which is an absolute condition, no trade stop here and there. When it's without weighing the cost, you got to look at both sides of the equation, not just one side. It's not just the status of the species, the status of its habitat, but it's why it's in that condition. And if you automatically list it out of caution, when without weighing that against its loss of revenue from use, its loss of incentive of the local people, suddenly are incentivized. You haven't. That's just poor judgment. It's not rational and reasonable to do that. But that's the way CITES is set up, and the politics are, protected. But it's in many cases it's make it valueless, reduce its value, reduce the management revenue, reduce the poaching control. Incentivize the local people to tolerate these animals. It really got off track.
So John, would you say that CITES today is still a conservation treaty, or has it become more of a political battleground?
Well, it's both. It's a political battle in a conservation environment. Some of these people here are not conservationists. They're protectionists. They're the animal rightists. The welfare of the animal does not come first. Right?
That is exactly what I think about often. That if activists truly cared about species survival, wouldn't they support the systems that actually work?
Yeah. They've initially animal rights groups admitted that it worked, and whatever it serves their interest, they'll admit it in a minute. They have books written about it, even by them, how we grow the number of animals. There shouldn't be so many animals. You can't win with them. But the abundance of wildlife depends not on their arguments, but on ours.
Right. If you had 2 minutes at the COP20 today, at the plenary mic, let's say, the last speech of your life moment, what would you tell the delegates that we're surrounded by?
Do your decision making with balance. Africa manages and has preserved the greatest number of megafauna and the greatest amount of habitat. And in many cases, more than 30% of their countries are set aside in protected areas. And that's just a fraction of the protected areas because the hunting areas are greater than the national parks. So the survival of this megafauna that so preoccupies us is dependent upon the sustainable use of that. And CITES is about to stop being used unconditionally. And if Africa is to, if we could get the African nations to vote uniformly, put Africa first in this agenda, and this agenda is its interest, not NGO interest in the developed world. They're not one and the same. If it puts its interest first, Africa, it was to be called the African Convention, and there would be those countries that have surplus of these resources. If they were allowed to use them for the greater good, everybody would be better off. But if they all vote together, support each other, 54 nations, a bit like the European Community's 27 nation unity vote, we'll have more wildlife, and we'll trickle down to the rural people in Africa. They have nothing except problems.
Before I move on to my last few questions, John, I often feel like there's a very strong sense of neo-colonialism that still exists. Am I right in saying that? Like keeping Africa in mind, especially?
It's a nice way to put it. This is prejudice against black people, period. Colored people. And it prevails. I have looked behind the scenes. I've seen the animal rights groups celebrate you at AIDS, the disease, all right? Because animals were going to be better off.
Oh my God.
Yeah, I've seen them celebrate that, and I'm talking about. You wouldn't believe some of the organizations that were just celebrating AIDS when it was more prevalent. But that's just its tip of the iceberg. I see it all the time. It's expressed that the humans are the animal rights are taken from humans to give to animals, and then the animals cease to exist because there's no humans that care about them. That make room for them, that tolerate them, or more so, that actually want to grow them. They grow the populations and increase their habitat. So everything backwards.
Well, you spent your life fighting for wildlife through rights and law and use, but it seems like this next decade is going to be quite brutal. More bans, more emotion, more digital activism. How does the sustainable use movement stay alive?
Like the users care dearly, and it's a bigger part of their life than anybody else's. So there's an army of millions, tens of millions of American sportsmen, for example, and that will prevail in some circumstances. But you got to watch treaties like CITES, where it affects everybody, right or wrong. I mean, things get lopsided when Southern Africa has too many elephants, and it would benefit from it. Just it drops. These animals die. Their ivory's all over. They're worth tens of millions of dollars or more if that resource could be spent on saving the animals, even if it was directed to other parts of Africa where their wildlife has been compromised. It would be much better off. So I don't know if I answered your question or not.
Oh no, you definitely did. I just often wonder that now that I'm involved, I'm 30 years old today. Now that I'm involved in this, if I'm going to give it my life, how do we win? Because, with digital activism especially, digital activism has really changed the game. I mean, if people weren't already manipulated enough in the past decade with social media and with posts, and you can put up a picture of a whale and put a nice little voiceover over it with nice little piano music and make it appear like all the whales in the world are going to die. It's very easy to manipulate the mind of the newest generation who's anyway not interested too much in things outdoors because they're in front of a goddamn screen.
Well, we have to meet fire with fire. There's some saturation. People don't really care after a certain level of they're bombarded with this stuff, and they don't really care. They have an impression, and what this common sense impression, which is dangerous, it's really ignorance. That's misinformed by people that are treacherous with misinformation, and they're wearing $2,000 business suits here. You don't understand? And the poor people on the ground in Africa aren't here,
Yeah.
and they're not permitted to be here. It costs a fortune. Those of us that know and care the most, we have to be here for them.
Well, my last question before I give the closing, John. I have observed in my very limited experience with the sustainable use groups that quite often either there's a lot of friction between us as well within our own groups, number one, or there's a chance that there are a lot of groups in the sustainable use community that feel scared to say that they feel support for sustainable use. Or maybe from the ARO side, or maybe the groups that are kind of neutral, the countries that are kind of neutral.
Yeah.
So what would you say to those conservationists that are kind of on the fence about supporting sustainable use because maybe they fear some kind of backlash?
It's a predicament that some very fine conservation organizations that are dependent upon their donors and don't want to they want to avoid the fight, but you can't. But they want to avoid the fight, and they don't take sides, and that's a tragedy because that number is growing. The hotter the hunting community's negative perception about the hunting community, the more of that we're going to experience and are experiencing. This predicament. So your podcast, all right, is important, and you're only 30, all right.
As you guys heard on the podcast today, John Jackson has spent decades doing something very rare, protecting wildlife by protecting people, defending conservation not with slogans, but with legal strategy, evidence, and grit. As we sit today at the COP20 in Uzbekistan, the world needs to hear this. Rights, especially human rights, matter. Use of wildlife matters. Communities who live right next to wildlife matter. Because without them, wildlife has no future at all. So John, thank you for fighting the fight that most people never see. And thank you for joining us on this episode of Use It or Lose It. I'm Veer Supunya Devavrata, and remember, if wildlife has no value, it will vanish. Use it or lose it.
Well said. Thank you.